Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the final session of our 2024 conference on communication ethics. Thank you so much for joining us. This session will be recorded and will go until about 4:15 Pacific time. So we've got about 75 minutes. Our panel will discuss for about 60 minutes, and then we will have a 15-minute Q&A period. Please add your questions to the chat and we'll address them in our Q&A. Following our session, we invite you to stay on the call to hear Dr. Peter Ryan close out the conference for us. So my name is Megan Reimer. My pronouns are she, her. I am an alumna of Royal Roads' Master of Arts in Professional Communication program, and I serve the School of Communication and Culture as a teaching assistant and research assistant. In the spirit of respect, reconciliation, and truth, we acknowledge that the Royal Roads campus is located on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and the Esquimalt nations, and their ancestors and families, who have lived on and stewarded the lands for thousands of years. I am joining as an uninvited visitor on the traditional unceded territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nation, a vibrant First Nation of the Coast Salish people residing on the eastern coast of Vancouver Island. I moved here last summer from the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi and the Treaty 7 region of southern Alberta. When I considered moving, I had a few must-haves for my new home, most importantly being in awe of the nature around me and being close to what I lovingly refer to as the trifecta: trees, mountains, and ocean. And these lands and waters offer me that every day. Jasmine's conversation earlier and Jean and Dennis's conversation earlier today have continued to open my eyes to how white colonizers have gotten it so very wrong. I acknowledge the atrocities that have occurred and continue to occur on these lands at the hands of white colonizers, people who look like me. And I am eternally grateful to the Snuneymuxw for stewarding the lands and waters I now have the opportunity and the responsibility to grow with, listen to, and learn from. I am humbly honored to introduce our panelists for a conversation on professional communication in Indigenous contexts: Julie Holloway, Tim Kenny, Allison Tedford-Seaweed, and Emily Gilpin. Dr. Wayne Clark was unable to join us today, but we acknowledge his contribution to this work. Julie, Tim, Allison, and Emily will discuss decolonizing principles to reinforce Indigenous ways of knowing and being, defragmenting organizational strategies in consideration of Indigenous voices that integrate values of respect, reciprocity, and renewal, how Indigenous engagement and partnerships achieve these goals, the relevance of ongoing relationship for maintaining trust and authenticity, and they'll share a case study to demonstrate how an organization has incorporated these elements into a corporate communication strategy in a good way. Julie Holloway is Haida and Kwakwaka'wakw and has been a guest on the traditional lands of the Snuneymuxw for nearly 20 years. Julie has spent the majority of her career working at the intersection of professional communications and Indigenous economic reconciliation. She currently leads communications at the Tulo Center of Indigenous Economics. Julie is also an associate faculty member in the School of Communication and Culture here at Royal Roads and co-teaches strategic communications in the Master of Arts in Professional Communication program. Tim Kenny is a mixed-race, non-status, indigiqueer man who grew up in Edmonton's community housing projects. His maternal Indigenous lineage comes from the Jean-Baptiste Gambler 183 First Nation in Calling Lake, Alberta. Tim has an undergraduate degree in public relations with a minor in Indigenous studies from Mount Royal University in Calgary and is currently undertaking his Master of Education in Interdisciplinary Studies at the University of Calgary, rooted in 2 year-long land-based modules that specialize in Blackfoot ways of knowing and being. In fall 2015, Tim joined the team at Inishti Treaty Arts Center to help birth the Red X Talks, Canada's first international Indigenous speaker series. In 2016, he helped bring Indigenous musicians and their craft to the Canadian forefront through Calgary's Juno Fest Indigenous Showcase. Tim currently works as a senior communications advisor at Parks Canada, where he works on various Indigenous communications initiatives, including National Indigenous Peoples Day campaigns, Indigenous Reads, Words Matter, and the award-winning Protect Our Elders campaign. Tim is passionate about Indigenous issues, including the intersections of gender, race, terminology, art, humanities, culture, and identity, and he is proud to lend his voice and continued support to these areas. Allison Tedford Seaweed is Nakwakto woman and member of Kwakiutl First Nation. She's based in Abbotsford, BC, and has over a decade of government experience contributing to culturally sensitive data storytelling, policy analysis, and program development. For the past 7 years, she's been creating information products and strategies that educate, inform, and delight in the private, post-secondary, and nonprofit sectors. Allison has helped entrepreneurs and brand leaders design their visions of inclusion, strategize about how to get there with practical, concrete actions, and find the words to talk about it. Emily Gilpin is Métis nomad. She's of Filipina, Soto, Cree Métis, Scottish, Irish ancestry, currently living and working between the west coast of so-called BC and Brazil. Emily is the Senior Communications Advisor and Community Storyteller for Coastal First Nations, an alliance of 8 First Nations across the Central and North Coast and Haida Gwaii. Before, she was the managing editor of Indigenous, an independent online media outlet, and ran First Nations Forward, a national observer series focused on stories of strength and self-determination. Welcome, Julie, Tim, Allison, and Emily. I'll pass it over to you, Julie, to lead the conversation.
Thanks so much, Megan, for the introduction. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us. And thank you, Tim, Emily, and Allison. It's so great to see you guys again. We had a little bit of a pre-meeting before this, what we're about to talk with you about today. And so one of the things that we thought we would do is share a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing. Emily, Allison, Tim, Wayne, and I brought Emily up to speed. We hosted in partnership with Royal Roads. We were some of the people on this call were co-organizers of the first of its kind gathering on professional communication in Indigenous contexts. During that session, it was a full day of a morning portion where it was in person with Indigenous communicators, just having a fairly open conversation about what it's like to work in these spaces. And then it was opened up in the afternoon to people to join online to just reflect more on some of the topics that came up in that discussion. So one of the takeaways from that day was a graphic recording. So I'm just going to share that now. And you can see some of the things that were talked about during that session. And so Allison, Tim, and I were a part of that day and contributed to the creation of this graphic recording. And Emily saw it for the first time when we met earlier last month. So I guess with this graphic recording up on the screen for us to reflect on that day and for us to start the conversation today, I'd just love to hear whoever would like to go first thoughts on what really resonated from you, either from that day or on the graphic recording.
I think one of the things that really struck me that day and inspired me the most was talking about, I think Julie was talking about, how storytelling is the closest thing we have to real life magic. And and I had been reflecting on some research that I had read about when you share stories that, people like the people listening, the people sharing, like their brain waves actually literally sync. And that's something that just really inspires me when I think about the capacity to create empathy and understanding, that storytelling really is the vehicle that can make such a huge difference. And that was something that I walked away from that session just really feeling hopeful for and feeling really inspired about my role in sharing stories of Indigenous excellence and the programming that takes place and all of the organizations and communities that are working hard to create new things.
I'll go next. I guess one of the things that really jumped out to me was that notion of relationships, through relationships that we're actually able to communicate. Because as we know, relationships are kind of the core fundamental to everything, especially as Indigenous communicators and as Indigenous people here. So I really loved that that message came through. Yeah.
I'll just add to that. I love that as well, about relationships and the importance of relationship building. I often say, like when I was wearing more of a reporter's hat, that I practice and believe in relationship-based reporting. And, you know, working in mainstream media or the mainstream media paradigm or other, you know, communications can be very extractive. You know, it can be a relationship of taking, a relationship of spectacle, a relationship of exotifying. So when you turn that on its head, you know, it says it in the description, it becomes more about respect, reciprocity, trust. And so when you're practicing relationship building with your own ethical compass, and upholding those that you're working with, it changes the way that the process of storytelling and the result as well.
Yeah, I think, I mean, some of the things that really stick out to me on the conversation that we had that day was about the relationships. It was about the storytelling. I love sharing that story about the study that was done on brainwave imaging and how when somebody starts to tell a story, the audience, the people that listen, their brainwaves actually start to map, like Allison was saying. And that's where that kind of, it's the closest thing we have to real life magic came from, is we've had these, as Indigenous people, we've had these stories. I think it's a beautiful thing that we've been able to see protocols and traditions and practices kind of passed down through millennia, and certain knowledge that's been able to be imparted with such intricate detail because of the power of storytelling. I think there's something beautiful there. I loved the conversation that we had about relationship-based understanding that relationships guide communications and that relationships are integral to the way that we do this work. One of the things that stuck out to me the most is just how much everything that we do operates in an ecosystem. We talked a lot about that day, how we all are interconnected. And just love being able to have these conversations where we get to talk about what it's like to be Indigenous people working in these spaces and the kind of commonalities that bring us all together. So I think I'll stop sharing now, and maybe I can see if there's a way that I can drop it into the chat later for others to see. But we did spend a lot of time. I did a new share instead of stop share. Talking about storytelling, and in our conversation leading up to this event, Emily, I know you and Allison do a lot of storytelling, and we talked a lot about how to do ethical storytelling. I recall at that gathering event in October, we did have questions from some people in the audience where we were talking about, with the increased awareness around Indigenous reconciliation and the effort to include more Indigenous voices, how there's a lot of work being done in a good way, but then there's maybe work being done from more of a just wanting to check the box in terms of getting stories about Indigenous people. And so I just wondered if there was, in terms of how we ethically tell stories, Allison and Emily, we had such a good conversation in the pre-meeting. I wondered if you had some insights that would be useful to share around how we tell stories ethically.
Yeah, no, I think one of the things that I like to focus on is doing really plain language consent gathering, so that the storytelling process is really consent forward, and really breaking down to people who maybe don't have a lot of experience having their stories told, like where their story might show up, and how it might be consumed by people, how long it might be available, and really breaking it down to really basic questions like, you know, if somebody Googles your name, they might find the story. Can you think of anybody who you'd feel uncomfortable reading this? And really thinking about the real life impacts and examples that somebody might have in terms of the impacts of sharing their story, and letting them reflect on that. I also really believe in, as much as a lot of people maybe don't, but I believe in a collaborative approach to reviewing drafts, because I come from a place of cultural humility, in that I may not understand, like I might understand the literal words somebody uses to share their story, but I might not understand what that means to them in their context. And so it's really about getting the story right and getting to confirm, is this what you meant? And is this an accurate representation, not just like linguistically, did I transcribe the words correctly, but did I capture the meaning, and did I position things in a way that's true to the story? And what aspects of the story were shared with me just for my own understanding, and what were meant to be shared further. So those are some of the pieces that I try to look at when I do storytelling, and trying to bring it to a really ethical place that keeps people safe and helps them feel like their story is being really well cared for.
That's great, Allison. I have to agree with everything that Allison shared. And I think another thing that I would say I learned from my colleagues in the Indigenous newsroom was our discussions around trauma-informed reporting. And reporter Kelsey Kalana, she really led a lot of trauma-informed reporting training for our group. And sometimes a story would get pitched and we would sit with it and really ask, what's the intention here? And what is the impact going to be? And not every newsroom does that. Sometimes it's like, if you're focused on likes or growing your audience or going viral, that's going to shift the stories that you share, right? But if your intention is to, share this story in a good way, and you know that the story is going to have a certain impact, then that will change your priorities in the newsroom as well. I think it's important as well when we're working with people to explain, like Allison mentioned, explain the process and then check back in and be accountable as well. And I totally echo on the fact that, cultural relativism, right? What I think I might understand, it may not be the way that the person intended it. So it's not just about fact checking, it's also about culture checking, checking back in, giving someone a chance to read their words that they shared in the context that you're sharing it. And make sure that it remains true. And it's not about, in newsrooms, for those who haven't worked in newsrooms, you're not generally supposed to do that, because people are worried that, oh, then you become an advocacy writer, then you're just a mouthpiece for this person. But really it's about accuracy, right? And so there's been a history of misrepresentation and inaccuracy. So we're charged with a new responsibility to be as accurate as possible. So part of that is that checking back process. And then I think, transparency as well of why, you're seeking this story, or where the story will land, or what the newspaper or your organization's intention is with the story. And then I think in terms of multimedia, making sure as well to have the highest quality photos and videos, which, we know a lot of news organizations or organizations in general don't always do, and that has an impact as well.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that are kind of coming up for me as you're both talking. One, I wondered if enough people really knew about Indigenous, Emily, and if you maybe wanted to share what it is, and the approach maybe that's taken there. And I will say that as a proud monthly supporter, that I invest in Indigenous journalism, and I'm a huge advocate for Indigenous stories told by Indigenous people, but yeah, for those that might not be aware.
Yeah, sure. Indigenous is an online media platform that got started with the help of Discourse Media. And I was just around Indigenous for a year, so I can't take, any accountability for the amazing work that the team is doing today. And I think what makes it different is that it's this outlet that's dedicated to showcasing Indigenous stories in certain communities. And the reporters and the team have done a fantastic job, of doing that and of making sure that they take the time. And one of the things I'll say in that process that was challenging is the bureaucracy, right? So depending on where your funding is coming from, there are certain deliverables or requirements that you're meant to do. So at the beginning, it was, report 4 to 6 stories a week, because then you're acting like a real news organization. But 4 to 6 stories a week with time, care, intention, relationship within this ethical space that we're talking about is not always possible or even beneficial. So we were always kind of struggling against that bureaucracy and those checkbox that we had to do. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to that. But check out Indigenous. I'll put it in the chat here.
Somebody did put it in already. Thank you. Oh yeah, there it is. Thank you. Tim, on the topic of pushing against bureaucracy and checking boxes. I know you have perspective on this working in the government, and that that a lot of your the land-based piece, when I looked at the graphic recording, I know that's something that you're very passionate about. And so just wondered if you had any thoughts in terms of things that have already been touched on, or think or a direction that you'd like to take the conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like as a working communicator, I've been a working communicator now, both on the non-governmental, on the other side, working for community when I started my work with Red Talks, and now working for the federal government. My thoughts and things have shifted a lot too. And I look at that graphic recording, and I keep coming to these conversations and asking, like, what do I contribute? What do I bring now? I mean, I think the biggest thing I bring is a perspective of an experience of land-based learning, and what that has actually done for me, and what it has the potential to do. At the end of the semester, I will have had 2 full academic years in land-based learning at the graduate studies level, engaged in Blackfoot ways of knowing and being. This is in addition to a 6-credit 2-week field school I took in my undergrad, learning from Treaty 7 nations. So in doing some research last year, last semester, when we had to write an end of term reflection, I came across a quote from UNESCO Canada that I'm going to paraphrase it, that says, if you think that land-based education is simply taking the classroom outside or outdoor education, that is exactly what it's not. It's not that at all. I assert that through my limited experiences in research, that land-based learning is the original form of education. It's inherently Indigenous, yet it's specific to the place and environment of each individual nation and our community here in what we call so-called North America, which means that we need to avoid a pan-Indigenous lens of looking at land-based learning across the whole. And when I think of that, I think of how it's maybe not appropriate in land-based learning to apply Anishinaabe 7 sacred teachings and applying them across all nations, or speaking of those in a Blackfoot context where I do my education. It's not appropriate. And I've seen that a lot in my work in government. I had a former minister who loved these 7 grandfather teachings when I worked in Ottawa, former Minister Bennett. And in a lot of her speeches and stuff like that, these 7 grandfather teachings apply, but she was giving speeches across the nation. So that notion doesn't quite go across and apply in context everywhere. So we have to avoid these umbrella terms and this pan-indigeneity that we seem to want to glom on to help make sense of things. So I also assert that land is the original teacher. In Blackfoot context, I've witnessed and experienced that land provides the origin stories. It provides songs, ceremonies, protocols, and processes, medicine, food, shelter, clothing. Everything one needs to survive and live a good life is contained within the land. Land-based learning also helps redress historical wrongs and bring balance to the harm caused to our Indigenous knowledge systems, epistemicide, as we also refer to it. And land-based learning has given me then a potential pathway to start to repair the severed connections to my own communities. As I mentioned earlier, and I'm really clear about my subject position, I am non-status, I am mixed race, meaning that I honor both sides of both my Indigenous side, my maternal Indigenous lineage. My great-grandfather is the man that our family's First Nation is named after, but yet I also honor my settler side, my father's side that comes from European context. So I use that idea of two-eyed seeing, but I'm clear about subject positions for a reason, because the need to position myself in what I speak of, I can only speak of things from my context and my experience. I didn't grow up in community. I grew up in the cities. So to sit here and try to speak pan-indigeneously for a whole cross-Canada experience. I can't speak for an Inuit experience. I can't speak for what it feels like to live in community. Those were taken away from me through policies of the Indian Act. The land-based learning has given me a way to repair those disconnects. Through it, even though I'm pre-Métis seeking land-based learning in Blackfoot ways, it has me asking questions and yearning for connections back to my own community, which are starting to repair. Land-based learning also is a process of listening. So often in communication, I think we listen to want to respond next, sometimes even to serve our own egos. But while I've been engaged in protocol and the process of ceremony, it might not look like a lot is going on around you. You might be sitting and waiting in the sun for processes and things to happen. but I'm just there as a witness. And by not necessarily wanting to ask too many questions and to just sit and be a witness, I think back to this teaching I got my very first summer in my graduate studies at Siksika Akakatsis, or what is also known as a circle camp or a Sundance in layman's terms. We're sitting there, and one of my teachers drilled the first teaching into us was that you get the questions, you get the answers for the things that are meant for you. So to come into these environments, and sometimes to come in as communicators or as workers, to come in, ask and demand things is not appropriate. You're there as a witness, you're there to listen. The Blackbird word is yitzi. Deep listen, that means listening with all of your senses. So land-based learning is that process, I believe, of listening. And when I learned to sit and just be a witness, I understand that there's a lot going on around me, even though it may feel like I'm sitting and waiting in the sun for processes to happen. There is so much happening that you would miss if you're sitting there getting ready in your ego to ask the next question. I guess in thinking about all these things, I guess I could assert that land is the original communicator. And to communicate by us, for us, with us, without ever listening to the land or visiting our lands, you're doing us a disservice. So where does that leave us, I guess, in the virtual circle? It makes me think, I guess, I want to point questions more than I want to come up with solutions, because I have a disclaimer here as I'm not going to have all the answers. I can't have all the answers to these things and these things that I sit and think about a lot. But I can't offer you what you're looking for. Is a quote I found when I was doing my capstone thesis in 2018. I found this quote that said, "I can't offer you what you're looking for, but I can tell you about myself." So that's what I think I'm here to do today, is to let creator speak through me, the creator to place me where he or she needs me, and hopefully through deep listening, people will find that little nugget or pearl meant for you specific, I guess, is a nice way to wrap it up. I'm an advocate for land-based learning. I continually will be. I guess my dream would be to, if next year is the final year of my part-time course-based master, would be to possibly build a case for build the rationale for Indigenous land-based learning in our context and in our discipline. Because I can tell you, when I was looking for a master's program, there is nothing out there like that. And even finding land-based learning in any disciplines, full year-long modules that are full immersive, they don't really exist. So I can just say that if I can build the case for it through my project work at the end of this course-based master's, fine. And then maybe through a PhD, that means maybe I can implement it or build a prototype of what that could look like in our discipline, because I think it's needed.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Long-winded.
No, it
You're
wasn't.
welcome.
It has me thinking about a lot of things, deep listening. I've just had the privilege of sharing space with Tim and Allison in this panel for the past couple of years, and I learn so much every time. I think communicators and the work that we do, it's, even though as a profession, beyond the profession, outside the profession, people might think that it's one thing or another, but then when you meet other people that do communications, it's so niche, or it can be so varied, the work that we do. And then you get into this area of Indigenous communications, and it can be even more niche. I work with, I have good friends like Allison, who does some amazing storytelling. I've got other friends who are really good at brand development and messaging. The work that I do is around communication strategy, and I work pretty specifically at my bio, the intersection between economic reconciliation, self-determination, and communication. And I just think it's so interesting, the different types of work that we do. And I also think it's, the more that we have these conversations, it's so awesome how there are so many similarities about the way that we approach work, even though we've never really had an opportunity until recent years to be able to connect with each other and realize that there is a foundation that we do all work from. And that's been one of the most surprising things to me, is the questions that we can get asked at times doing our work. It might seem like second nature to us because that's just the way that we approach work from an Indigenous lens. Indigenous ways of being and knowing. And so I'm sure it would be of interest to the people that are participating today, what some of those things that we might take for granted in terms of the way that we show up to the work. Emily, you touched on some. I'll just say from one of the things that I know I do that I didn't realize was a little bit different until I started having conversations about it was even in drafting a media release, like when I'm working with Indigenous communities or people, one of the things I'm always really sensitive about is how to privilege their voice in the telling of their own story. And so I try to lend capacity where I can and provide a lot of options. So if I'm working at an organization and we're partnering with a First Nation and we want to get a quote from that First Nation, I will usually ask, like, how do you want to do this? I can draft something for you for your approval. I can chat with you on the phone for a couple of minutes and then take down what you say and send that back for your approval. Or I can just wait for you to send something, whichever is going to work best for you, just let me know. And so I really, while I don't do impact storytelling per se, I do in these moments make sure that I'm trying my best to give the option that's going to work best for the First Nation. So for me, it's a big part of the work of reconciliation is really about lending capacity, institutional and organizational capacity where we can. I'm curious to hear what you guys think.
I think an easy win is terminology. It seems to be my work has landed me on a lot of fears about talking about terminology. I worked on a project that the government of Canada has an internal document called Words Matter. And in 2018, I was working with being the pen on all the edits that were coming through on that and thinking about terminology. I'm thinking like in terms of like applicable case studies. Recently, Jasper National Park worked with two nations to revive a historic treaty to get support for a harvesting activity in the park. And it was a really beautiful thing to watch happen. And my role actually was smaller from the national office perspective, but I did provide advice and things like that. But what the big teaching I got out of that was the word reconciliation. It's a really beautiful buzzword that we like to use a lot, but it has different sorts of meaning to a lot of different people. And using that is actually triggering. And in context to these two nations, one of the nations actually said, we have nothing to reconcile. We have done nothing wrong. So why are we coming to the table in reconciliation? What we're really doing here is redressing historical harms. So I think we need to even start thinking about language and terminology in this buzzword of reconciliation that we like to use a lot, that my government likes to use a lot, that I support messaging for. So it's interesting. I'm a terminology boy, so I think that those are some easy wins there. And just in consult and having good relationships with community, having good relationships with the land, again, you will figure and find out these things. We heard these from the ground level up. It came through to me, and now when I see things that say reconciliation, I give it a second thought. I'm reviewing documents now where I'm like, oh, I don't know if that's the best word to use in this. What really it is redressing historical harms. Indigenous people have nothing to reconcile in this relationship.
I'll just riff on that a little bit. In my work, I've reported on different communities, different legal agreements with different levels of Canadian government. And some nations are involved in so-called reconciliation framework agreements, where there actually is an economic and legal, relationship to this idea of reconciliation. And many nations have identified what does reconciliation mean in our own language, in our own cultural context. And so often, the Heiltsuk Nation is one example, Hesilstu, turning things around and making it right, so different nations will have different terminology for the intent or the spirit of, different work that they're involved in, what Canada likes to understand as and use as reconciliation. And, what you're talking about, Tim, made me think about too, with the homogenizing terms. It also made me think about conversations I've had around Turtle Island. I think there's this wave of Turtle Island. Great. Now we can refer to the content of so-called North America as Turtle Island, but not all peoples have the same creation stories, origin stories. And so, you know, I've had people say, I don't say Turtle Island has nothing to do with our stories, you know? So it's also just keeping that in mind, place-based, place-specific, context-specific, people-specific, trying to avoid generalizing, homogenizing. I think those are all really great tools. And, you know, my role at Coastal First Nation is Senior Communications Advisor and Community Storyteller, but I'm a little bit, you know, not sure of the community storyteller. You know, I respect my boss who gave me that role, but, you know, I like to think of myself as a vehicle for stories. You know, I'm not telling these stories, I'm a vehicle, you know. And I heard a writer, I don't remember, a long fiction writer say one time that, you know, she writes these books and sometimes there's like a wind that comes down from the hill, and if she doesn't sit herself down when the, you know, the spirit of creation and inspiration is coming, then it could move through her, or she could miss it. And, you know, that makes me think about what you're talking about, letting the spirit speak through us. You know, how can we organize our organisms in these roles and responsibilities that we play so that we can be present and listen, and that we can, you know, uphold people's stories and we can hear what they're telling us. It's amazing how, you know, you can have someone listening to something and you're missing it because there's so much that's pulling at our attention. So, you know, I'd like to just add being a vehicle and then also organizing our own organisms so that we can show up in a good way.
I just want to riff off of the idea of storytelling for a second too. I keep getting drawn back to what I see done that I don't think is maybe the best practice is we're hungry for stories. We're hungry for Indigenous stories. It seems to be mainstream media, settler colonialism, settler society is hungry for our stories. And if we're not honoring the Indigenous values of storytelling and what that actually means. So in Blackfoot world, storytelling, like I said, it comes from the land. Land is the first storyteller. Land is the first communicator. Land is the first teacher. And if we're just coming along and plucking stories without the Blackfoot value of reciprocity, which could be a common pan-Indigenous value, I'd say, but I don't want to. I'm trying to avoid pan-Indigeneity as much as possible in Blackfoot context. The idea of reciprocity is there. So if you're collecting a story or you're in an act of collecting data, or you have to think about as communicators, how is that giving back to our communities? How is that restoring land back, lives back, metaphorically, physically, energetically, spiritually? And if your work is just to collect and you're not finding a way in Indigenous methods or Indigenous values to get back in the spirit of reciprocity, you're doing, again, a great disservice. So I think that's somewhere communicators, practitioners, academics can start to look. If you're conducting research with Indigenous communities, how is that work going to get back to the community? And if it doesn't, then you need to rethink about what you're doing. And how is that work community driven and community led? A lot of times we're, again, hungry and going in and asking questions, and that notion I talked about, you'll get what's meant for you. And you're going in and asking all the wrong questions and asking these things, trying to gain what you think needs to be the solution or the help. When if you just listen to the communities and let the community drive the work, you would see what you need to do. And so I'm constantly thinking about that in a lot of the work I'm doing now, especially academically. I'm like, how is my research work going to get back to the Blackfoot people that have given me so much? And it has to be. And if not, then I'm not in balance.
For me, the way I look to the work that I do is looking at, I mean, I believe in looking at the terminology and making sure that place-based references are appropriate to where the stories are being told and whose stories they are. But I also really look to the narrative overall and looking at when we do impact storytelling, where's the recognition of the strength of the communities that have been in participating in whatever initiatives that are being shared about. So is it a collaboration of a cool thing that a bunch of people got together and did, or was it a rescue mission? Those are the ways that those kind of power imbalances can find their way into storytelling, and they can be a way when we think about relationships. When a story is a celebration of relationship, it needs to be done in a way that protects the relationship so that it remains after the story. and people need to be able to feel like they've been respected in the way those experiences have been shared. So that's something that I try to come back to in terms of when I'm doing impact storytelling is, how are people positioned? How is the strength recognized? How are we honoring what people have brought to the table? And also looking to recognize it in a lot of cases, a lot of communities have had their narratives appropriated. And so in practicing consent-based and consent-forward processes and collaborating, there's an opportunity to, I mean, I believe do some kind of healing work around being able to reclaim those narratives and to be able to share them and do it correctly and do it in a way that feels good. So that, those relationships can continue and people have the experience of being heard, felt, seen, understood, and having their perspective honored. And I think that's really a really important aspect of how we take care of these stories and how we take care of the people who've shared them with us. So those are some of the approaches that I take that maybe are less mainstream, but that's my how I like to be in relationship with the people that I get to celebrate, and that, to make sure that the stories that I share acknowledge that, we're more than what's happened to us, and that there's, a lot of very important history that needs to be shared as part of the truth and reconciliation. But part of the truth is also that there's like so much excellence and so much brilliance and so much strength and so much healing and so much beauty. And when we focus on the people who come in and do things that are helpful, we miss exclusively we miss out on the beauty of all of the people who are in relationship and all of the people whose stories are represented. So that's how I like to approach my storytelling.
Thanks. There's just, yeah, it's hard to kind of pick a thread out of everything that we're talking about and keep it going. I enjoy these conversations so much. I think, oh, I just lost the train of thought that I wanted to talk about. For me, in the work that I do, I work with at the Tulo Center. We provide university accredited training for First Nations administrative staff that are implementing jurisdictions under the Fiscal Management Act here in Canada. But we grapple with these issues in terms of storytelling at times, like maybe around June 21st and maybe around September 30th, where the narratives are really can be focused on stories that keep us frozen in time, like these mythical kind of ideas of culture and community. And the work that I do in the day-to-day is about, how do we move closer to a life beyond the Indian Act? How do I get to a place where my kids aren't wards of the state, where I'm not a ward of the state? When, like, I dream of a time where we are not just the fiduciary responsibility of the Crown. And there's a lot of work to do to get there, and a lot of work being done. But those aren't the narratives that are in the general kind of public or discussion, the work that we are doing around advancing legislative amendments. But I find it fascinating, and spending my whole career kind of trying to move the needle in one area. And I do come up against this idea that we tell stories about ways of knowing and being and living, but in a time before, and where there's just so much work that is being done now. We've always been a modern people, and we always have used the tools of the day to be able to advance our nations and our communities. And that's so I spend lots of my day and my time thinking about those kinds of things, and those stories, in my opinion, aren't being told enough. And so when I have opportunities to be able to share about some of the work I'm doing, I love to do that, because there's so many cool things. I just saw Tim's comment about Indigenous futurism. I've seen, because we talk about being a modern people, like how cultural protocols can be brought into the modern time and what that looks like, and how we can take our ideas and bring them into a contemporary context. So there's having my kids be in the kind of public school cycle, we were learning a lot about reconciliation, and I find, this is my personal opinion, that we can get kind of gassed out on residential school stuff because we all know about the harms. And I don't mean we all, like the general public. I mean people that have like this Indigenous lived experience know about the harms from residential schools, and that's not like the defining thing about us. There's so much more to talk about, and the work being done to advance our nations and to close the gaps, the socioeconomic gaps. I mean, it's hard work, and it won't be done maybe in my lifetime, but to contribute to that at a small level is definitely something that keeps me going every day.
Thank you, Julie, for that. I think that's important to think about some of the actual implications of this work. Right now, I'm in a space that is, so-called conservation space, and maybe Tim can really relate with your work too. But like, I think it's important to ask the questions, what if we're not here? Like, what if these stories aren't here? What if this storying approach didn't exist? What would happen? Well, when you look at specifically conservation, you would see photos of bears and trees. You wouldn't see the people. You wouldn't connect the rights and title and inherent responsibilities. You wouldn't see the governance and the culture. And so, part of my job is to really showcase people and governance and culture and show that interconnection that we're talking about to land and to place, and to so-called resources. Because, otherwise people can get washed out, and then that has real impacts on management decisions, and decision-making processes. So the invisibility, right, the intentional invisibility, there's so many people working on so many levels to combat that. And I think there were some really good comments made about research as well for people who are in research. There are so many different nations that can use solid research to amplify and support their own science, their own knowing, their own oral stories. Especially, and there are legal and political implications to that as well. So if you want to work with a nation, go ask what that nation needs you to research, rather than saying, hey, I've got this question and I want to sit down with your community. It's like, find out what people need you to be researching, and then, that will direct your work, and then you can be a vehicle for that community's need. So it's just really turning things around in the way that these colonial systems have been working.
Beautiful. And I think that goes back to the comment that I was saying, like that about just lending capacity where we can, like if knowing that we're working towards reconciliation, totally taking the point that reconciliation might not be the right word, but we're looking for some measure of reparation. How do we do that? And I found I've had a lot of success and had a lot of good relationships come from working with organizations that really are there to lend their capacity and to support a vision that they maybe don't understand themselves, but that they're willing to show up and help. And with help being the primary goal, and not the being able to market that they've helped.
I think too, like, as an organizational representative, not as an Indigenous person, I think our organizations have got to stop patting themselves on the back for doing the bare minimum of what they need just to be doing. We often so much want to celebrate, oh yeah, we've done this work. Well, I'll be happy when I don't have to fight in the academy to have Indigenous knowledges even just equal. Where I think if Indigenous knowledges are the first knowledges and the first communication, they should actually be more prefaced than Western knowledge. But just the fight in academia, in knowing that I'm going to have to go into a year next year that's not land-based, that I'm going to go into a discipline that's not my own, and I'm going to have to fight and legitimize these land-based ways and the epistemologies and ontologies and methodologies that I have gained out of 2+ years of land-based experience. I'm going to have to fight for them. I'm not looking forward to that. I'm looking forward to the day that I don't have to do that. But because there's nobody else doing it, I guess I just keep thinking that it's a lonely road being an Indigenous communicator sometimes. And I think we've probably all felt it at some point, where you feel like you're the lone island sometimes, fighting for, defending for some of these things. But I just keep thinking, and if it's a word of wisdom to help us all get through the day, is I want to be the elder I've been looking for 10 years. And I have a responsibility to be that elder I'm looking for. If not for me, for the next 7 generations. A pan-Indigenous teaching, yes, but yeah, I think about that a lot. And all I guess I can do is keep showing up and be the elder I'm looking for, whatever that means.
One thing I'm not sure if I said earlier, I am an alum of the Master of Arts in Professional Communication program, and I'm just so thrilled to be able to give back and teach one of the courses in the program. And even though it's not Indigenous, it's strategic communications is the course. It's inherently Indigenous because I'm there and because I can bring in Indigenous speakers and people that can give or bring in case studies about Indigenous organizations. And one of the things that I like to do in that class is just do a little mini lecture on Indigenous communications and talk about performative work and how, maybe 5 years ago, a land acknowledgement seemed like a really powerful step in terms of acknowledging where we are and where we need to go. But in my opinion, they have become one of those performative, like we spend more time perfecting the words of a land acknowledgement than we do on anything else. And as practitioners, as communications people, if that's our goal, is just to make sure that we're checking the box, we're always going to be approaching it wrong. Because we really, when we're thinking about our role as communicators and how we can contribute to this work, we need to be able to ask ourselves, is the work that I'm doing actively supporting the emancipation and empowerment of Indigenous peoples and communities? And when we can say yes more than we can say no, we're going to know that we're on the right track. That's something that we can all just take and consider, like, is the work that we're doing substantively going to move the needle, or is it performative? And if it's performative, maybe there's a way that we can move away from that work. If the goal is Indigenous reconciliation, bringing Indigenous views and voices to the work that we're doing, I think that's just a really important thing to keep in mind.
No, I would definitely agree. And I mean, as somebody who like worked in government before and has a lot of experience working around policy, and does work around land acknowledgements, having the right words are something to like, that's something to aspire to. But being in right relationship is the thing that, the words support the relationship, the policy supports the relationship. And something that I've been really fortunate. I'm a grad student at SFU this year. I'm doing a Master's of Arts in Communications Research for social change. And when I see that, they're doing work around their policies and their procedures, what I'm really struck by is the relationality and how those intentions are being lived out, in my day-to-day life as a student. And I think that's where we need to really center things back to is, who are we trying to be, in relationship with? Who are we trying to be connected to? And, land acknowledgements are easier when you're speaking about the people you're in relationship with, right? You don't have to be looking at a map because that's, Bob's home community and, you gather for, dinner on Tuesdays, right? That's a lot easier than referencing a map because you're referring to something that's real, that's lived, that's experienced, that you're invested in. So I mean, we have to start somewhere, and I, that's a teaching like my grandfather has always instilled in me is that, even for me, like as a First Nations woman, our traditional territories are, in the Port Hardy area. And so our family has been raised, away. And so he's always taught me that it's important to be acknowledging, the people on whose land I'm doing this work. And that's an important matter of protocol. But I think it's also really important that the words don't mean it's like, getting your mom a really nice Mother's Day card, but not being present the rest of the year, right? And so taking that land acknowledgement, and like, how are you honoring the people of the land and the work that you're doing on the territory? And how are you caring for them and honoring their wishes? And how are you stewarding how are you protecting, how are you caring for the place that you are fortunate to be, and having that come through. So policies and land acknowledgements are good, but living them is better.
I would love to, I fully wholeheartedly agree with that. And through land-based learning, I have grown relationships to these places now. And through those relationships, I'm getting teachings from them that have impacted my life so meaningfully. I have a responsibility to these places now too. And that in turn impacts my relationship to a land acknowledgement. And I put in the chat, like, how can we move past this performative template? I know as communicators, all four of us are probably asked daily, how do we do a land acknowledgement for these people and stuff like that? And I just want to say, well, you haven't been there, so okay, there's the problem first, but all right, if we're going to start, what is your relationship to, if say this area has a treaty, what is your relationship to understanding the treaty of this area? That's a big key in acknowledging that agreements and were made to do this work. I also, when I think about treaty, I go back to land-based education, and that land-based education is the first form of education. A lot of my research so far has turned up in some of the treaty transcripts or elders' documentation of the spirit and intent of the treaty. The intent of those treaties in many cases was to share education, was not to be epistemicide, but it was that we will share our Indigenous children with you so they can learn your ways. And in turn, you will send your white children to come learn our ways and learn off of the land. Those parts weren't honored out of the treaty relationship. So I keep going back to, like, how do we rebalance, like, the erasure of our knowledge systems? First of all, I think it kind of, for me, it has to go back there, and how to rebalance and redress those historical wrongs.
It's kind of moving a little bit off topic, but not quite. But I know our time is coming a little bit short. I do want to emphasize now, right now in the world, we're witnessing, and again, with witnessing comes a responsibility, not to be pan-Indigenous, but with witnessing comes a responsibility in many spaces that I've been, and as a mixed person with mixed experiences, it's something that I've seen in a variety of spaces. We're witnessing genocide, and part of what's happening is there's been a profound dehumanization of a people. And it's a story that many Indigenous peoples across the world know too well. And, there's a book that I could offer for folks who might be interested called Seeing Red, which looks at how Indigenous peoples have been represented in Canadian newspapers. Stereotypes, false narratives, dehumanizing narratives. So part of this work of, ethical communications is rehumanizing, not to say that there has been actually any kind of dehumanizing that's happened. It's the narrative, it's the words as weapons. It's the deep, deep embedded racism within the Canadian subconscious and consciousness. So, we have to understand the profound misrepresentation and the profound, dehumanizing narratives that have existed here and where Indigenous peoples are and minority groups are all over the world, and what the life and death impacts of that are. Another great book is by Candace Callison, Reckoning, Journalism's Limits and Possibilities. So I'd also recommend that book as well for people who might be interested in diving a little bit into, the role that media plays in narrating Indigenous peoples and the spaces that take up. So I just want to say that because sometimes I think these conversations, we want to really understand how real they are, how real the impacts are, how real stories are and narratives are. Because when you dehumanize a human or a group of people, anything is possible. And we're seeing that in the worst way imaginable.
Yeah, one of the stories that I've shared in the past is about working as an Indigenous person at a non-Indigenous institution. And when the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women was released, there was nothing in my job description that said that being Indigenous was a part of my job, but it so quickly became a big part of my job, this free emotional labor And so during work, I was just trying to go about my workday and was inundated with very kind reaching out to see if I was okay. And I find those things to be very difficult because it's very kind and it's meant from a good place. But I was just trying to go about my workday as somebody that has experience with missing and murdered women and girls in my life. And so I think that it is easy to forget as a non-Indigenous person that doesn't really have direct experience with our lived experiences, how much that is actually in our day to day and how much that we deal with that's just kind of right below the surface. And so that's something that I think that everyone could benefit from, just that understanding that these issues affect us directly and affect us day to day. And I can leave this session and go and do something out there and experience racism and not being taken seriously just because of who I am and what I look like. And I think that's something that surprises non-Indigenous people, but shouldn't. This is a really good country, but it's not safe for everyone. And we've got a lot of work to do until we get there. And I think that's important to remember as well.
This has been a beautiful conversation to witness, so thank you. If you guys would like to continue chatting for another 5 minutes or so, we've got 2 questions in the chat. But if you want to take another 5 minutes or so to keep chatting, you're welcome to, and then we'll address those questions. And if you feel we're done, we can get to the questions too. I know 5 minutes is not a long time. You tell me.
I'm happy to answer some questions, unless Julie, you had something.
No, I was going to say the same. And I think, yeah, if there are any questions, I know we've covered a lot of ground. So just appreciate all the comments. I'm trying to keep up with the chat. But yeah, if there are questions, I'd love to hear what people.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions. I do encourage you to read through the chat. Thank you, Emily, for capturing some points as people have been speaking. There are a lot of beautiful comments in the chat. Other Indigenous communicators who have indicated they felt alone in their work and feel connected through you. So I encourage you to take a moment to read through that. So in terms of questions, our first one is, do you have any tips on someone wanting to learn from the land, but are not sure where to start?
That's a loaded one, but like I said, I'm not going to have easy answers. I think the answer is you have to advocate for it. There needs to be more land-based education in almost every institution across in this country, and I think it's despicable that there isn't. I think it's despicable that I had to jump disciplines to create a land-based experience for myself, because that's what fed my soul in my undergrad, was the land-based experience that I wrote a capstone thesis from. And funnily enough, that capstone thesis where I left off, I've now picked almost right back up cyclically with the work that I'm doing with the same communities. So I don't think those things are accident, but I would say seek out opportunities. There's plenty of opportunities to attend ceremony in your nation, in your regions with the various communities. Make yourself known. Relationships with our people. Again, I would love to have an easy fix and say, here, go talk to this elder and you'll be set up. You have to just keep showing up. You have to keep showing up with our value systems, being humble, reciprocal, great gratitude, gratefulness. As soon as you get those pieces right, and as soon as you start showing up, I promise there'll be opportunities. I'm a living testament to it. Like, I didn't think that I would ever be studying this way, but there is. And I think just by being humble and showing up regularly, and if there isn't programs in your area, advocate for them, write about them. Use your research, use your pens if you're academics, advocate and build cases like I'm trying to build for land-based education. Leave those seeds for other academics that'll follow in your path to pick up on your work. So I'm sorry that's not an easy answer to that, but there are a few programs out there, and I think there's going to get to be more. It's a shame that some of them are only semester long or like a sessional, like a 2-week sessional in the summer, but they exist. And if you just go out and seek them out, you'll see them. University of Saskatchewan has a great graduate level program that incorporates land-based learning at the graduate level. And my program at U of C is still continuing to continue. They're year-long modules, and I always seem to go pick the Blackfoot ways of knowing and being. You can do that for 2 years, and then you end up in the third year of having to do classic research and methodology studies. Granted, it's a different discipline, but worth it.
Beautiful. Thank you. As someone mentioned, there are so many distractions, and these very important considerations might end up as barriers preventing starting the listening and connecting needed to get it right and not try at all. Have any of you struggled with knowing whether or not to tell a story or to tell a story without respectful honoring?
I've definitely been in situations in terms of the timing of a story where I'll be working on a story or we'll be about to share a story and something has happened in community where the level of attention is going to distract from what needs to happen or what people are dealing with in community. So I've definitely been in situations where it's been like, not right now. We're going to circle back to this later when people have had some time to grieve and to work through the things that they need to work through, because the story isn't about what's really important right now. It's also an important story, and it needs to be told at some point, but now is not the time. And then also just recognizing where, we have these editorial timeframes and we have ideas about what stories we want to tell, but we need to look at, what's happening, or what's their capacity to participate. Is this, like, as much as we would like to tell the story now, is this something that we can actually bring to fruition at this time while taking care of our partners and our friends? And if this is the kind of relationship that we want to celebrate it, can we protect it by making sure that everyone is, well rested and able to address things at the right time in the right way? So those have been my experiences for sure.
That's great. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, go
Julie.
ahead. You go ahead.
I'll just add a short point to that. Like within the journalism realm, there's also an option to get out the story, like even if it's a couple paragraphs, like if it's important to the community or important to the person to have it out, have something out, and then you can circle back and add more. There's an option. It doesn't have to be in one specific way. You can come back around and add more details. I think transparency is really important. You can write in the story, what's going on. There's this time constraint. We're going to come back and fill in more details. I think that whole not being transparent doesn't really serve people well, but that, I'll just add that there are possibilities that you can kind of find a balance.
Not so much in storytelling, but I will say at the Tulul Center, we try lots of different ways of engaging with our students and our alumni. And so one of the things that we do is we do have a podcast called Bundle of Arrows, where our alumni come together and we have a discussion, and I do a lot of work with them to make sure that they feel comfortable before we go on air. And I do try to guide them, but there are times where, because the work that they do, the alumni it's so niche and they don't get to connect. It's similar to what we're doing now, where they get excited and they might start sharing a story about a particular instance, or they might start talking about a new law that they're developing. And I try to we at the Tulul Center, we take it very seriously that we have this conversation, but then we make sure that we're editing out anything that might get that person in trouble. If they're talking about, like, if they were telling a story about a particular person, we want to make sure that we don't do that. Or if they're telling a story that talks about amount of revenue that their First Nation might generate, we're very sensitive about the numbers and stuff. So they might be just speaking from their place, but we feel like it's a responsibility of us to protect them, to make sure that that participating in our project doesn't negatively impact them or their community in any way. Because while we're in a very niche field, we all understand the nuances. We definitely appreciate that the general public doesn't understand the nuances too. And so we're very focused on making sure that those experiences in terms of participating in our communications efforts doesn't negatively impact, like I said, them or their community in any way. And so with that just becomes a level of sensitivity that we're not identifying anybody, or we're not putting something out there that isn't just couldn't be understood by a layperson.
Beautiful, thank you. I have a question for you, and we've been highlighting a few of them already. So, Julie, you said, you know, you're looking forward to how we move to a life beyond the Indian Act, where Indigenous people are not just wards of the state or the fiduciary responsibility of the Crown. You know, that the stories around residential schools are important, but do not define Indigenous communities. And it got me thinking about how the narrative of Indigenous people is often still an oppressed narrative. And Allison, you were talking about how much bravery and strength and courage there are in Indigenous communities. And it got me thinking, I want to hear those stories. So you have mentioned, I know Emily, you previously worked for Indigenous, and I would like to go and sign up. And we've mentioned the Bundle of Arrows podcast. Can you share some other resources maybe where people can go and get those supportive, strength building stories of our Indigenous communities?
Follow Coastal First Nations. And I think also there are really brilliant Indigenous journalists spread out all over the place. I think we're working from within the belly of the beast and from without, and we're everywhere. So I like to follow like individual journalists at the CBC. You know, sometimes you see a CBC story and you're like, wow, that's a great story. And then you look, you're like, oh, of course it's this badass Indigenous journalist who wrote that. And then you see another story where you're like, what the hell? What's wrong with this? And then, you know, so people are everywhere. I think it's like seek out the individuals and the organizations that are telling, you know, impactful stories. I'll throw out, of course, Coastal First Nations. I'm kind of helping support the social media. And a big part of it is putting, you know, representation matters, you know, putting out photos and videos and TikToks and, you know, whatever else that we can do to meet all kinds of folks at different levels. Yeah, I'll just say that.
I'd give a shameless plug for an organization I was very proud to work with in 2015, Red Talks. Our work and our legacy still lives there. Those videos we capture, not every single Red Talk event, which again, to give folks an idea of what a Red Talks event was like, it was an Indigenous speaker series, but it wasn't just an Indigenous speaker series. It was rooted in ceremony. It was blessed by Blackfoot elders, and Blackfoot elders put forth the idea and supported the notion and the vision. So the beautiful, rich videos that still live somewhere online, I can maybe go find the link real quick here before we end our discussion. Some wonderful conversations with some brilliant people, artists, thinkers, people working in the spaces, people you want to hear from, and their stories of resistance, empowerment, and cultural surgence and survival.
One of the projects I absolutely love that I get to support is there's an organization called Taking It Global. They have a fireside chat series, and it is a series of interviews with Indigenous professionals across all sorts of different disciplines, from like medical illustrators to, you know, people who work in mining or forestry or like any job. I mean, it's kind of designed as in terms of like a virtual career fair where Indigenous youth can look and see kind of what options are available. But it's integrated into this map called Whose Land, where you can go, and when you're looking to see where different traditional territories are, you can also find interviews with the people of the land there. And I just love that it's a celebration of Indigenous excellence, and something I'm really, really grateful that I get to participate in terms of turning some of the interviews into blogs for people to read. But there's just so many great stories there of people's experiences making their way through school and work and family and life, and really capturing a broad range of experiences from all over, from the north and from everywhere else. Definitely check that out if you get a chance.
I think everything, I mean, I've seen some in the chat too, some recommendations for books and movies and different things to watch. I'm a huge fan of a lot of Indigenous podcasts, any of Connie Walker's work. There's a podcast called On All My Relations. There's tons of podcasts. If you're on TikTok, hashtag Indigenous TikTok or hashtag Native TikTok will definitely help you soak in some Indigenous voices and perspectives and get to see our funny side because we are really funny. And one of the things that I did at the Tule Center, because we are headquartered at the Kamloops Indian Reserve, or residential school, sorry, when the discovery of the 215 happened, that did happen right at the places that we work at every day. And so we wanted to shift the narrative, and we started doing a series of posts about historical and contemporary Indigenous issues in Canada from the perspective of Indigenous people. And then we rounded those up into all on one page on our website. So I'm just grabbing the link right now to copy that. If you are interested in learning more about the white paper, 60 Scoop, other policies that have affected Indigenous people before and now, you can kind of get a glimpse of some of that on that page there. And I think between all of the recommendations that we've thrown out there, you could be reading, listening, and watching for a long, long time.
I agree. Thank you so much. It is 4:16, so we are going to wrap up. Gratitude to all of you, Tim, Julie, Emily, and Allison for joining us today. And extended gratitude to Wayne for his contributions to the work, even though he couldn't be here today. Thank you so much for your time, your energy, your space, your brilliance. It's been a beautiful conversation. I just want to be part of it. Thank you guys so much.
You are.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. Please don't leave yet. I would like to pass it off to Dr. Chase Remillard and Dr. Peter Ryan to close out our conference for the day. So stick around.